I think that's been the ultimate key to my personal success, is just building a team around me. We talk about that a lot, and especially the educators out there are talking about building a team and everything. And I think it's very true. I think how some people go about it may not be the best, because I think in this day and age, it really feels like we know the people pretty quickly just through the power of the internet and social media and people who are putting themselves out there. We tend to think that we have really strong rapport, that they might have strengths in some areas that they're educating on that they really don't.
Your network is your net worth. Come listen to some of the most successful people I know share invaluable knowledge, stories, and advice in real estate, business, and beyond. This is Weiss Advice. Whether you want to take your business or personal life to the next level, look no further. Welcome back to another episode of Weiss Advice. I'm your host, as always, Yonah Weiss. Excited to be here today. It's a beautiful day, and very excited to have Kyle Jones on the show with us. So welcome.
Thanks, Yonah. Happy to be here.
It's great to see you, and love the background. As always, you guys who are watching this video, you'll see beautiful blue skies wherever he is in the world. But if you guys don't know who Kyle is, he's the founder of TruePoint Capital. It's a real estate investment that focuses on multifamily and ground up development. So I'm excited to get your perspective on a couple of things that we haven't really discussed too much on this show, especially we've had tons of real estate investors, tons of people on the multifamily, hundreds of amazing guests. But development is not something we've talked about a lot. And I'm just curious to kind of, maybe we'll dig into that a little bit today. But before we do, give us a little bit of your background, how you went from a tech career into the real estate game and doing that full time.
Yeah, I think the quick story and the quick version is, I saw a better lifestyle on the other side of freedom and an opportunity that became a side hustle, and started with single families, started flipping homes, kept a few of those as rental properties, and then realized that I wanted to go bigger as I proved out the concept of real estate investing to myself. I wanted to go bigger and scale it out, and eventually had goals and aspirations to replace our expenses with the income coming in from the rental properties. And so through that, I realized I needed to either get very aggressive and acquire more single family properties, or try to become smarter about it and go bigger, which led me to multifamily.
Gotcha. And I'm curious to know, because everyone has a little bit of a different approach, but how soon did you go into this, doing the fix and flips and doing the single family stuff, that you brought on investors? I'm just out of curiosity. Was that like very early on? And some people, like their first deal, they take investors. At a certain point, they just realize that they need to have some outside capital in order to scale. So at what point did that happen for you?
It was about a year and a half. It was two parts. I had a nice cash reserve set up for myself through my W-2 job, which was high-tech sales. And then also I really wasn't familiar with it at first when I first started investing in real estate. But as I started studying, and especially when I started studying multifamily, that's when I got turned on to, okay, people are actually raising capital for this. They're not just using their own money, because I'm also looking at it and like, okay, I buy one building and I'm toast, like that's it. So how do I continue to scale? And so, there was an education process, but it was about a year and a half from the time that we started actually intentionally investing, I should say. We had done some one-off investments prior to that I wouldn't really factor into my ramp up period.
Gotcha. Okay. Obviously everyone has a different approach to that, but it sounds like doing it in a smart way. And you had that, that cushy, sales job, right? High paying tech sales is obviously a good cushion to fall back on. At what point did you realize, okay, I got to just turn this and go full time into the real estate?
It was probably about my fifth or sixth syndication at that point where I realized, hey, we're onto something here. This is actually starting to really make sense. And here's how we can structure the deals that's both advantageous for investors, but also for us to get us to a goal of replacing our expenses. And just over time, it took about 3.5 years to actually replace my expenses and my income at the same time to be able to feel comfortable to hit the eject button on the W-2 job. Wow. So it felt like a long time, but in hindsight, looking back at it, that's a really short amount of time. Yeah. But that shows you the power of real estate and what it can do for you. And that's really all it is. Real estate is a vehicle for me. don't wake up and dream about real estate and dream about deals. I am a deal junkie, but I don't, eat, sleep, and breathe real estate. I take a little bit of a different approach to that. And so, I think that has helped me continue to grow through the trajectory of our progress, because I'm not getting married to these deals. I'm not getting emotional on these deals. I don't feel like I need to just do a deal to do a deal.
That's important, because you see a lot of syndicators out there just doing deals to do deals, making the numbers work. How do you steer clear of that? I mean, do you have partners you coming in on every deal with other GPs or other partners as well? Is it really just kind of you running the show?
At this point, I have one primary partner on the syndication side. And then I also have, we have a development partner as well who carries the development experience. Because when we started getting into that, we didn't have that experience at all. We knew how to manage and operate the multifamily side on a stabilized deal and a value add deal, but taking a from true raw land to, where we're at now, we needed to get that experience. So we partnered up with an individual on that. So, but I really am starting when I made a hire for our asset manager. So when I actually offloaded those responsibilities to an individual who had a ton of experience, she can just look through it through a completely different lens. She's looking at it in so many different facets that really we should all be looking at. But it got to a point where, hey, I know where my strengths are, and I want to offload these areas where, either they're just not a strength of mine or I just don't enjoy them. And so that's where she kind of came in, and she keeps us in check as well.
That's awesome. Knowing what your strengths are and finding partners that can balance you with their opposite strengths. That's a key to a successful business, successful partnership.
Yeah. And just to elaborate on that, Yona, I think that's been the ultimate key to my personal success, is just building a team around me. We talk about that a lot, and especially the educators out there are talking about building a team and everything. And I think it's very true. I think how some people go about it may not be the best, because I think in this day and age, it really feels like we know the people pretty quickly just through the power of the internet and social media and people who are putting themselves out there. We tend to think that we have really strong rapport, that they might have strengths in some areas that they're educating on that they really don't, which frankly got us in a little bit of a bind early on in our career, where we were relying on somebody who kind of portrayed themselves to have very strong background, and turns out they didn't. So we had to learn, on our own. We had to learn how to put out the fire when the building was on fire, and the other partners didn't carry the experience that they had. So you just really have to be careful. You have to do your due diligence. You have to get to know them. Don't just get to know people through Zoom. Make sure that you're getting out. I know COVID put a pause on that, but here we are. We can travel again. Everybody get out, meet people face to face. Because I think when you get somebody face to face, it's completely different. You can still hide behind this beautiful background. What you don't see is this complete mess behind me that my kids have destroyed my office. So I'm hiding something, right? So you don't get to see that picture. So that's just the power of getting out in front of people. You tend to get to know somebody just on a deeper level. And it's really key to continue to grow through finding the right people. This 100%. Is a people business.
100%. No, that's an important perspective, especially given the fact that, when you can partner up with someone, and to be misled, I mean, that happens all the time, unfortunately, in business. And I've heard it on multiple occasions. It's unfortunate to hear when things like that happen, and you got to learn the hard way sometimes, but hopefully that will make you much more cautious in the future. And, make sure that you make those real connections. And you're absolutely right. Meeting in person. Listen, in the business that I'm in, I've worked, with hundreds and hundreds of, probably close to 1,000, investors and syndicators across the country that I know and I've dealt with and talked with. And unfortunately, I've heard some bad stories and some horror stories out there. And it makes me a little nervous that, people reach out to me and ask me for an opinion on something, and someone like, hey, I see you deal with these guys. Anything you want to say? And I try to keep my mouth shut as much as possible, unless it's really going to be a big problem. But getting out there, making sure you're being honest and dealing with investors, making sure you're taking care of their capital. I think that's the number one concern that everyone's focused on. And that will steer you in the right direction, hopefully.
Absolutely.
I want to touch on, I mentioned in the beginning, and you mentioned you do have a development partner that has helped you. I know you guys have started some ground up developments. That's something that takes, obviously you need a partner to do that. It's not something you can just figure out on your own a lot of time. Although many people have and attempted to, and well, maybe you can. I shouldn't say that you can't figure out on your own, but having a partner definitely gives you that learning curve and gives you an advance on that. So when did you decide that, development was the option or was something that you wanted to pursue as well as just the regular value add, buying multifamily like everyone else is doing?
What clicked for me, so I'm actually based in Houston. So this background is not in Houston, it's Huntsville, Alabama, which we own, 1,200 units in. But, so being in a big market, we saw pricing take off much quicker than I think a lot, especially being in Texas. I mean, Texas is just like Florida and a lot of the Southeast now, but people have been paying attention to Texas and investing here for quite some time. So the thing that clicked for me was when I realized that these, 70s and 80s vintage continued to skyrocket in terms of just looking at the sheer price per unit. Okay. And why I was looking at it like that is because if I look at it, okay, if this building completely burned down, now I'm got to take into consideration what would the cost be to essentially build this back. And so, when I started kind of drawing the comparison between the two, and then also started seeing that, hey, I want to pay more attention. I'd love to own these A-class assets. They're beautiful. They're nice. And how are these people buying them? So you see that the pricing continues to take off there. And then at some point, I started having conversations with a couple of people who have done development and even some landowners, some, guys with tons of experience, the 70-year-olds who are kind of nearing the end of their development career and just really seeking some wisdom there and talking about what's the cost of construction, the total cost. So when I say total cost, the hard cost and the soft cost, and that's something that people don't really pay attention. Hard cost is pretty straightforward. Hey, Mr. Contractor, what's this going to cost to build everything all in?
Although it's gone up a lot.
Well, it's gone up. It's gone up, and it's harder to pin that down for sure. But it is more straightforward than your soft cost and like some of these other things that people don't even really think about. And I wasn't aware of some of the other fees and everything and all these other vendors who are associated with development. So the thing that really shifted, going back to the original question, was just understanding that the cost per unit on the open market was significantly higher than the cost of construction. I would still stand by that even in today's market. And we're listening to this in June of 2020, where the interest rates have continued to climb. Inflation is at 22, whatever, whatever the real number is. We're still in a point now where I'm still very on target in tracking towards development than just buying these value add deals. And because of that, you mentioned the hard costs have gone up. They have, but what we're seeing in certain markets, this is not every market, and this is why you really have to understand your market, but in certain markets, it is still significantly higher to purchase that property on the open market than it is to actually build.
Absolutely. I think that has to do with, obviously the rise of inflation and the rise of, the market in general, every market. The cost of these assets have just gone up exponentially, which is crazy to a certain extent, but you're absolutely right. The cost of building it is certainly going to be much less.
Well, and to talk a little bit about, because I think, a lot of people will say, well, there's so much risk in that. And how do you really control your costs? There's certain things that you can actually do on the front end, at least on the hard costs. And the soft costs are pretty straightforward. Those don't really change. What I was talking about earlier is just understanding all of the soft costs that a development deal incorporate. So those aren't really changing. What is changing is the material. So if you have a supplier that comes back, it happened on a project of ours where the window supplier came back and said, we can't fulfill this order. Now what do you do? Well, you have to go to another vendor. And when you go to another vendor, they might say, hey, what used to cost X 6 months ago now costs X now. And that's the type of market that we're in. So the way that we control our risk and control that is two parts. Number one, you sign a contract with the general contractor that basically locks them in and locks all the subcontractors in to a certain price. So now it is just controlling the materials at that point. So the next part of that is buying out the job, buying out as much as you can. And if you have to store it offsite in a storage room and you're paying, a small storage fee or whatever to do that, it's worth it. Or that's smart. A lot of these vendors have storage at their facilities. Like a lot of these window suppliers, yeah, they'll go ahead and guarantee that order and then they'll put it aside because they have the warehouse space or things like that. So that's how we do it. We buy it out up as much as we can up front where it makes sense. So now it takes, we're doing it now. We just broke ground on another project this week. And that's exactly the approach we took on a project that we did 2 years ago. When lumber was at an all-time high, we actually bought our lumber package in 3 tranches. And now where lumber is today, I don't even know, but it's come down significantly, $600 per board. We're buying out the entire job. So that's just the strategy that we're working with to control our costs. So I didn't mean to go down on that tangent on development, but that's how we protect our capital and protect our risk.
That's a very smart way of doing that. I have heard that before, and it makes so much sense just to buy your inventory as much as you can, store it. It's going to save you a lot of costs down the road. If you can afford it, obviously, you may not be able to have all the capital to do that, but I guess that's something to underwrite into a deal to make sure you have enough capital to buy supplies up front, especially with supply chain issues. It's not just the fees, not just the prices, and just availability is really what's slowing down a lot of projects. And time is probably the biggest factor that is going to come into play when you're talking about making money and returning money to investors, because a development, you set it for 18 months, right? 25 months, whatever it is. And it's up taking, a few months longer or a year longer. That's going to eat into returns.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I appreciate you going down that road because, again, like I said, we haven't had a lot of guests talk about that. So I appreciate leaning a little more heavily into the development side of things because there are insights we can all learn. And for those of you who are our listeners who are tuning into this, are excited to learn because this is an area you mentioned some really great points about why this is more desirable than in a lot of ways than buying, outright multifamily rental, although it comes with its own risk and its own challenges. So, highlighting those and understanding those is really the key.
It does. And I would sit here and argue, because we still own 70s and 80s properties. There's a lot of risk in that. We just had to sell 2 assets because our insurance premium rose by almost 300% in the time frame that we have owned it. That's insanity.
Wow.
And a lot of these insurance premiums, that's a whole nother thing that I think people are not really paying attention to. In Texas, we have property taxes and then the insurance devil that are just going gangbusters. And, there's risk in everything that we do. And so we're looking at it, okay, where can we really get the best bang for our buck in time? And if we're going to go into a deal on a 70s and 80s vintage where we're projecting really low cash flow, and in most cases, no cash flow year 1 and 2 before we get in there and project rent or raise rents, we'd rather do that in a newer asset, something that we can control. And, something too, that if we did have to end up holding it for a longer amount of time, at least it's a brand new asset and we can just, refinance at the cost of our construction loan and hang on for, however long we need to. And so I look at it now, development is just the ultimate value add. It's, if you really look at it, you're taking raw land and putting a building on top of it. So it's just a different value add strategy than the 70s and 80s vintage. And I'm just at a point where I think I'd rather put my money into a development deal right now than, try to, go in and renovate more units on a lot of these properties. These 70s and 80s have traded, 2 and 3 times in the last 5 years now. So how are you going to go? Right. I know people are convincing their investors that they're able to extract even more money out of this, this property that the previous 3 investors couldn't do it in the last 5 years. But, it's just a tough pill to swallow when you get in there and it's really tight and things aren't what they were. And I'm saying this because we're living this. Like, we have properties in our portfolio where the story wasn't exactly what we thought going in. And so now we're just in, damage control, or, we do what we can to get out. And so, thankfully, a lot of those properties that are in that boat, we've either sold out of, or, the ones that we have 2, I think, still in our portfolio that would probably fit that mold, we've been saved by the market. And so we're just buying ourselves a little bit of time, and then we'll plan to exit those. But that's where I go back to, okay, where do I see more value? Because I think there are a different set of buyers. There's so much capital out there, and people who are interested in new product are some of these large institution types, these REITs, and they're always looking for ways to generate more fees. So As long as you're buying in a decent market that is growing and expanding, I think there's always going to be a buyer for those types of properties.
That's for sure true, especially with much, much more capital being, flooding into from private equity, from these REITs and Wall Street, that it's just making it much more attractive to sell off these properties to them.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure what the long game plan on that is, because at a certain point, there's going to be much less inventory out there. Well, I guess we'll see. We'll sit back and wait. I'm curious, kind of a tangential question here, but you mentioned, sometimes with these 78, 80s properties, you may not have cash flow in the first year or two. I'm just curious, from an investor and from a passive investor standpoint, which I myself am, how do you present that to, potential passive investors? And, again, this is just curious on your approach, because I've heard many, many different approaches here, but are you sharing, revenue even when there's not cash flow, or are those returns only being given once there is that cash flow?
Yeah, I think, the first part of that, how we present it is, well, first of all, I generally try to stay away from properties that don't have at least a little bit of cash flow, some type of buffer that I can see. Mm-hmm. So, when I first started, this was very true. And we have properties in our portfolio where we could project, 6% cash on cash just in the first year without even really doing anything. That has gone down tremendously. And, what I'm really paying attention to is two parts. Number one, if it doesn't have any cash flow year one that I can see based on the financial model, then it better have a true value add story. And what I mean by that is, okay, after you adjust, it's a lot of detail. After you adjust, going into year two, year one, we underwrite, nothing changes, except maybe taxes and insurance, because you do need to protect yourself there, because those will change. Outside of that, nothing else changes unless you need to, you're buying it from somebody who is just running it really lean on expenses. But it really, in terms of rent income, nothing changes. Year two, then you really can start looking at the bumps. And what a lot of people are doing is they say they can increase average rents by $100 to $150 on average per unit. And that's just not true. On a 100-unit property, even, there's almost no way, unless you just started evicting people or kicking people out within the first week of ownership, to turn that over and see that income. Like, there's just hardly any way that can actually come true. So you have to see a gradual increase. If somebody is going in and saying, hey, we're under market by $200 in rent. Okay, that may be true, but where are they forecasting that? What year do they think they can hit that? And realistically, that's probably not till year 3 or 4 at the earliest, because of
right. You're not going to come in and bump rents right away.
Never.
I've seen
you can try, happen, but you're going to lose. Now you're going to create a lot of vacancy. And so, right. and we have bought properties where, they're true value add. So they were great scenarios. We bought them straight from the developer, and we bought 3 properties like this. 2 of them were from the same developer. One wasn't from a separate developer. And when I say developer, these properties were developed in the 80s. And so both the developers hadn't really increased rents in, 6-7 years. And when they did that, it was like $25 rent increases at that time. So you can imagine how much true value add is there through just, injecting a little bit of fresh capital in there. So that's what I mean. That's a true value add story. And I would just caution people from a passive standpoint, you really got to understand, okay, where are we projecting these rents? And then even on the exit. So outside of that, if I'm looking in year 3 or 4 and I see these average rents, okay, these average rents are pretty good. They didn't just jack it up the second year. Right. What did they do on the exit? That's the other piece. So where's the exit cap rate or the exit, price per unit? That's a whole nother thing that I've seen just even in this market, where there's some craziness going on, where people are saying that they're going to increase enough value in here in the course of 5 years, where, if they're buying it at $100,000 a unit, they're going to actually be able to sell it at $200,000 a unit. In some markets, that might be true. I would argue that in some Florida markets, you might be able to do that. Except, although you're going in, you're not going to find a property for $100,000 a unit in Florida right now. But, right. In most markets, that's just, for me, that's just too aggressive. Especially in the market that we're in now. And so, those are the things you've got to look at. Okay, what's the year-to-year annual income? And then let me check the expenses. Let me make sure that they're factoring in increases for taxes and insurance. And then even payroll. I mean, our payroll has gone up significantly just in the last 6 months too, because of just where inflation is. And then what is the exit cap rate, or what is the exit price per unit, and how does that influence the deal returns and the projections?
Yeah, there's so many factors that go into that. And I guess having a lot of transparency and just knowing everything up front obviously gives a lot of knowledge and power to the investors. So a lot to consider here. I appreciate all the insights here. And I want to transition now what we call the final four, Kyle. So you ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
Here we go. This first question is, what's the worst job that you ever had?
The worst job I ever had was probably my first job, which was just working at a mall in one of those little kiosks, in the middle of the mall, not in one of the stores, and I was selling these little $10 sunglasses. That was probably the worst job. It was because we never had, I think I maybe sold probably 10 pairs of sunglasses in the year that I worked there. That's how busy we were.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I hope you weren't being paid on commission.
No, thankfully I wasn't. I did not have to do any tough labor. We didn't grow up on a ranch or a farm, so I didn't have to do anything outside, but it was just very, very boring.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that can be extremely boring, just sitting there and doing nothing. Right.
That was before cell phones too. So I didn't even have I couldn't watch Netflix or anything while I was doing that.
Oh man. All right. Second question for you. What is a book you've read that's given you a paradigm shift?
I think one of the biggest books that I've read, the obvious answer to me comes with my Bible, the Bible, but from a business, or I'm trying to think of that. I think Cash Flow Quadrant is the one that I think really shifted my mindset and gave me a lot of practical things to think about. A lot of people, it's Robert Kiyosaki. A lot of people, know Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but a lot of people haven't read Cash Flow Quadrant. And that is what really changed for me, and to really look at how do I move into the B and the I quadrant. If you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. But that was like a paradigm shift. And I've recommended that book to a few folks who are just kind of stuck in the rat race, or even, some business owners. I've got a buddy who owns 3 different auto shop franchises. This book has completely changed his life and how he runs his business, because, he used to be so hands-on in his business. And now he's really created a system to where, he gets to step back because he's trained up the right personnel to actually, manage the day-to-day. So
yeah, absolutely. No, that makes sense. That's a great book. And I'm glad you recommended it, because it hasn't been brought up many times, maybe once or twice in this podcast, but it is a very, very powerful book. And even though he mentions, the quadrants there in Rich Dad, obviously he goes much more into detail in it.
Yeah.
Awesome. So third question is, what is a skill or talent that you would like to learn?
Skill or talent? This one was hard. I know you gave me a little bit of time early to think about it, but anything whatsoever. Windsurfing, underwater, basket weaving. I was going towards wake surfing. So
there you go.
I've got a buddy who has a boat, and I've, grew up skiing and wakeboarding, but wake surfing is kind of the new thing. And it has not come as easy to me. I think partially because I'm older than I was when I first got up on a wakeboard. So it takes a little bit more time, but wake surfing is fun. And the times that I've gotten up, it is fun.
That's awesome. That sounds like a good one. It's interesting. We've had a few people mention surfing on the show before, but wake surfing, that's a little bit different, but kind of same idea. So very good. Well, good luck with that. Hopefully it works out.
Thank you.
Fourth and final question. What does success mean to you?
Success for me is all about truly being free and, being able to do what I want whenever I want to do it. Then now you start looking at the high level. That's the overarching way that I view success. So what does that look like? I mean, not being a slave to money, not being a slave to, an individual, being able to want to spend time with my family. I mean, my family is my prized possession in this earthly life. And, just being able to devote as much time as I want to them, and not feel like, I got to be doing something else. I got to be doing more in the business. I got to be doing this, truly being able to unplug and allowing me to be present with wherever I am.
Right. That's awesome. We get that a lot. And obviously family is the most important thing for a lot of people, including myself. So having that time, having that freedom, and obviously, like you said, not to be too pulled by money, because that's not really what it's all about. I know a lot of people measure success by numerals, but that's, very unfortunate and misleading in a lot of ways. So Appreciate your insight on that. And
Absolutely.
Last and finally, Kyle, where can our listeners find you or reach out to you?
Yeah. So our website is just TruePointCap.com. That's our website. And there we send out a weekly newsletter, pretty easily accessible on all the social media channels, Facebook, LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn quite a bit, and then Instagram as well. I'm not as, post heavy on Instagram, but, definitely easily accessible across all those. So it's just my name, Kyle Jones.
Sure.
So,
all right. Well, we'll make sure to put that in the show notes, and appreciate you taking the time with us today, Kyle. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it. Thanks again, Yona.
And to our listeners, thank you guys for joining once again. And remember, the best advice comes only when you ask. Real quick, I have one question for you. Did you like this episode? If you did, I want to ask you a huge favor. See, the biggest thing that helps this podcast grow and that will spread this message to the whole world is that if you leave a review, a rating, and subscribe to the podcast. What that does is it basically tells the platforms that this podcast is out on is that you like my stuff and I'm doing something right. So take a few seconds out of your day, hit that subscribe button, leave a rating or review. I would be extremely grateful. Also, I want to hear from you guys. So I want to hear some feedback. If you have any questions for future episodes, please find me on LinkedIn, send me a DM, a connection request, Yona Weiss, and I'd love to hear from you.